our next speaker. She's Rachel Wetzel, and she's a photograph conservator at the Library of Congress. I first met her a few years ago while she was working at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts in Philadelphia, and it was the first time I had ever had something conserved, and I was very nervous. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but I was absolutely fascinated, and Rachel made my visit very easy. She was very warm and helped me to understand the process of what it takes to conserve something. And walking around the floor of the labs in Philadelphia, I was insanely jealous because I thought I would love to work here. Folks meticulously spending hours looking at color chips and things like that. I was definitely quite taken. So Rachel is now here in DC, and I learned at that time during my visit to Philadelphia that I think she was coming towards a conclusion of the Robert Cornelius project and the Daguerreotype database project, and which catalogs, I'm sure that some of you, maybe all of you, know about this, but I was quite fascinated by the process of cataloging all those images. So tonight, Rachel is going to talk about caring for early to mid-19th century photography. So Kurt's going to get us set up here, and while he's doing that, give a warm welcome to Rachel. One of the comments we have is enjoying a Crown Royal and ginger ale in my slippers, watching Am I Live? Life is good. That's Jean McCallum. I hope you don't mind me calling, she doesn't mind me calling her out. All right, Rachel, all yours.
Hi, thank you. I just want to point out that I am almost finished with the Cornelius.
Oh, I did.
It'll be on the Library of Congress's website in June of 2020.
Oh,
so I'll make an announcement later. But I'm not done. So.
I got ahead of myself, sorry.
But we're not here to talk about Cornelius today. We're here to talk about collecting and caring for early 19th century materials. So the importance of photography, to me, this is the big reason why you all are here in the room. I mean, I think photography is the most amazing invention ever. If you think about before photography, we also didn't know what we looked like in portrait form, but also for you, for the Civil War, photography is documenting time and freezing time and keeping something more relevant and accurate for this generation and future generations. So I think, you know, the idea of documenting the First War in the United States, documenting the building of the Capitol expansion or buildings around DC or anywhere that you live, there's photographers working and capturing these moments. So it's really important, I think, to keep these and preserve these so that many future generations to come can enjoy and understand history with the visual aspect and not just with written literature or accounts. I think photography is really powerful in that way. But photography is also very delicate, and it deteriorates very rapidly, and it has a lot of things that it doesn't like. So this is like a list of things that will affect your photographic materials. So we all know about light, but also the temperature in the environment is really critical. So high heat is very bad for photographs, but also fluctuations in relative humidity and the temperature also will make changes in the photographs that aren't so desirable. And then the materials that they're in contact with. So lignin is a material that's used, it's from wood pulp, and it's used to make newsprints, and you all know what aging newsprints look like. So materials like that will interact with photographic materials. anything that's acidic, bad environments, sulfur in particular, ozone, prolonged water exposure, so if you have a flood or a leaky pipe, that's going to be really detrimental to your photographic collection. And then 19th century photography is all handmade, so it's not machined like 20th century, so there's a lot of error and discrepancy in the way that it was produced by whether you had a diligent photographer or a lazy photographer. So some of that stuff you can help. And then the things that we do as modern people to our photographic collections, like sticking tape on them and gluing them down to photo albums and putting paper clips on them. Those kind of things are all going to harm the photographs in the long run. And then also the way that we handle them with our, after we've just eaten lunch and then we touch our photographic collections, all of these factors play into the long-term stability of a photograph. And when I'm talking about stability of the photograph, in particular, and all the things I'm going to talk about today, I'm talking about silver. And while paper can interact with a lot of these things, the primary thing that makes a photograph kind of difficult and fussy for long-term care is the fact that silver is very reactive. Particularly 19th century silver, which is made of colloidal silver, which I'll talk a little bit about later. So the first thing we'll talk about are the cased objects. So again, we're using silver across the board, but the daguerreotype is a little bit different than the rest of these things that I'm going to talk about, because the daguerreotype is a pure silver plate and the image is formed by a silver-mercury amalgam. That is in colloidal silver. So everything else is colloidal silver, but because the daguerreotype is pretty much all silver, it deteriorates very rapidly. The Ambrotype and tintype use the same type of silver nitrate to form the image, so they behave in the same kind of way but have slightly different issues, which I'll go into. So daguerreotypes, I'll start out with, this is my general area of research. Daguerreotypes, their main issue is that they have a lot of deterioration mechanisms that are based on the fact that they're all sealed up. But they're all sealed up because it's very necessary to make them not tarnish. But as daguerreotypes age, those paper tape seals that they used in the 19th century that are adhered with some kind of water-soluble adhesive like gum arabic, they fail over time. And then that allows moisture and temperature changes and pollutants to get inside this, what we call microclimate. And generally we think of microclimate as being good, and it is, except when it fails, and then it isn't. So in this case, the most common thing I see with daguerreotypes is glass corrosion. So all of this haziness is, 19th century glass has a lot of aluminum and silicates in it, and when it gets in the presence of moisture, it weeps out. So this is one called glass weeping, and it forms these droplets that then are literally like hanging from the underside of the glass and sometimes fall on the daguerreotype plate. So this is something that if I changed the glass would probably improve 100%. But this is a common 19th century problem. And then also we have heavy tarnish. So again, when you have this microclimate, and in the package of a daguerreotype you have a brass mat like this, you have metal to metal contact, and you have two metals that are corrosive, and then they get moisture stuck in between them, and then they both start to corrode and interact with one another. So when you see the corrosion of a daguerreotype, it usually is you can usually pick out the shape of whatever this brass mat looked like, because it's where the two metals sit together. Then they generally tend to corrode, and they corrode from the the outside in. And then the daguerreotype is silver on top of a copper plate. And the copper is the most significant part of that structure, but the silver layer is incredibly thin. So it can be damaged really easily. You should never ever touch a bare plate daguerreotype. It can be scratched and abraded very easily. So in this case, if you can see here, what looks like a little green mushroom is actually copper corrosion that has gone through a pit, a little hole in the silver of the daguerreotype. So that migrates to the surface, and then it's, as a conservator, this is really terrifying. And even if you can take it off, it's gonna come back. So you never wanna get a pit on your daguerreotype plate. And then there's been a history of daguerreotype cleaning over the years, and this goes all the way back into the 1850s when they started using potassium cyanide, because they found that these daguerreotypes tarnish very readily, and so they would clean them. Only, many years later, then more deterioration shows up. This is a daguerreotype by Robert Cornelius that was cleaned with thiourea that was introduced in the 1950s, and the potassium cyanide from the 19th century is damaging, but the thiourea forms these complexes with the silver that are not water soluble, which means that they cannot be rinsed off. And there's been some studies in the 1980s where they used electrocleaning and then they were rinsing, and some of that material becomes water soluble after electrocleaning. But a plate like this, or a plate with hand coloring, or just a lot of plates that are of the early 1840 period could never be electrocleaned. So if you have a daguerreotype that's been thiourea cleaned, and this one was pretty aggressive, you can see this is ultraviolet light, and it shows all these thiourea complexes on the surface. And this is specular illumination, and it shows what they call the Daguerrean measles. And that's the kind of material that will not come off. So cleaning daguerreotypes is not really recommended. Moving on to the Ambrotype, now we're getting into this colloidal silver that I'm talking about. So the Ambrotype has silver nitrate in a collodion binder, and that is poured onto a piece of glass, and it looks like a negative, even though it's not really a negative. But when you have a black backing, you can see I have it over half of this image, then the image appears. This black backing, or it's called japanning, was also something that was hand coated. Typically it's 2 pieces of glass, but sometimes it's one, where the collodion's on one side and the japanning's on the back. And what happens is the collodion part, because they were varnished, generally tends to hold up pretty well. But this japanning, when glass expands and contracts when it's in a fluctuating environment, that japanning tends to delaminate or pull away from the glass support that it's on, and then it flakes off. And when you have that, it looks like we're missing a lot of the image, but it's just this effect of the negative positive thing that the Ambrotype does. So this was a treatment I did where I just replaced the black backing, and it made the image whole again. Okay, but there are some, again, like I mentioned, depending on whether you had a very diligent photographer or a lazy one, there were people who tried to make these things very fast. So in this case, the collodion was poured on one side of the glass, and then the japanning was poured on top of it on that same side. So when it started to flake off, it pulled the emulsion off with it. So putting a black backing on this is never going to make the image come back. So again, it's, how it's constructed and whether or not people did a very good job. One of the reasons that the Ambrotype holds up pretty well is because it tended to be varnished for the most part. This is a ruby Ambrotype that was never varnished. So you see how it's very sort of silvery and blue in tone. That's the silver, the colloidal silver tarnishing and breaking down. So if you have an unvarnished Ambrotype, then you can't go back and revarnish it. It's just, these are now more sensitive than their other counterparts that were varnished. And you can sort of see on here was a spot where the varnish didn't quite get to the plate, so it's got this blue circle, and there's nothing as a conservator I can do about that. And then tintypes have, they also are collodion, so silver nitrate and collodion binder, but they're on Japan pieces of iron. And these tend to be, of the three, probably the most stable and in the best condition. And that's just because they were typically just varnished. And you can see they, variance in tone, and they tend to hold up, and the fact that they usually aren't cased and they're usually just tossed around, I'm pretty surprised most of the time that they look as good as they do. But they can have problems. It's still a metal and it corrodes with moisture, so this is the iron rusting, can eat through all of that Japanning layer, and this is the back side and this is the front side, so you can see it's sort of bubbling the emulsion. And because these are sort of thin pieces of metal, they can crease very easily. So again, storage is pretty critical for these, but for the most part, they're less light sensitive, and they're easier to handle than an Ambrotype, even because Ambrotype, you have two pieces of glass to worry about cracking, but these are, more, I think they were generally, handed out like how we would hand out business cards today. And then for paper prints, we have the salted paper print, which was used for many different things throughout the early 19th century. So you have a lot of your landscapes, and you'll see a lot of Civil War salted paper prints. It was used for portraiture indoors and also used for maps. And we have a number of these maps in the Library of Congress if you're interested in seeing them. These were made from either wet or dry plate collodion glass negatives, so you might have some of those in your collection too. Those tend to not survive as well. I think a lot of them were wiped off and reused again, or because they're glass, they just tend to get broken and lost over the years. And we have more of the evidence of the prints than we do of the negatives, but you might have those in your collection, and they're very much like the Ambrotype, where they're the same silver nitrate and collodion on glass. So behave sort of the same way. One of the things, salted paper prints are, they're what we call a one-layer structure. So the silver is coated directly on a piece of paper. So the silver lives without a binder in the interstices of the paper fibers that are sort of woven together. They have a very matte appearance as a result, and sometimes they were toned and sometimes they weren't. So you'll see salted paper prints that are really brown, and then you'll see salted paper prints that are really purple. And the purple comes from gold toning, so it's gold chloride. And this one here was toned, and you see what happens is you get this really rich dark purple versus this is the fading part, where what it looked like probably when you first made it before you toned it. So the colloidal silver is really a tiny particle, and it's so small, and it tends to just create a brownish red color. It's not big enough to create a true black. So people wanted to make things a little more contrasty, and that's where the gold toning comes in. But in salted paper print, it's more of an aesthetic choice. But you can see when you have this is from an album page, you have adhesive overall, and then you have it, when you have the outside perimeter, that's where the the atmospheric pollution is allowed to get in and move in inward. So you'll usually see perimeter staining versus you'll see the more pristine part of the area in the middle. Although I have seen a lot of albums from railroad albums that where the album pages are really thick and they sort of buckle, and so then where the air gets in, it makes localized stains. So there's something about the air movement that causes this phenomenon in albums. Again, as a conservator, there's nothing I can do for that. You can't retone it with gold. So the idea of stopping this before it happens is the way to go. And again, I'm talking about the toning, so moving into albumin. Albumin is sort of the same as a salted paper print. It's silver nitrate, only at this time we have a binder. So this is made with egg whites. And that egg, now instead of sitting with the silver inside the paper fibers, it sits on top of the paper fibers in this egg binder. And the difference with that is it just scatters the light in a different way. So now you get, it's not totally glossy, but it's way more glossy than a salted paper print. And you can see here's two different, same image, one that's really gold toned and one that's faded. So you can see the kind of difference between something that's been kept in really good condition versus something that hasn't had that opportunity and has had maybe some environmental fluctuation. So you get, because it's made from egg, the binder yellows, so that's one of the main things you see with albumin prints. But also that gold toner starts to break down and you get into getting the reversion from the purple back to the red-brown color of the silver. These two are on the right are pretty extreme, but this is a portrait of a woman, and this is a scene where the silver is so deteriorated that there is barely anything left of the image. So you don't want your albumin prints to get to that point.
That's from the light.
It can be from, I think there's light, a lot of it's light, but this I can see, this is like adhesive damage and some mold, so this probably had a lot of water exposure. I can't pinpoint deterioration from, but light is definitely a factor. Again, CDVs, these ones happen to all be albumin prints, but these two I own, I bought at the same time, but clearly this one was sitting underneath this one, so this one took the brunt of all the deterioration from, you know, being out in the environment, where, you know, this one, they're kind of faded to the same level, but this one clearly has more yellowing of the albumin and some foxing or molding in the egg binder. This I think is a good visualization of the sort of red-brown color that the colloidal silver makes. So it's like this color, but when you tone it, it becomes more purple, where it looks almost black, but it's not quite black. This one has more yellowing of the binder and some adhesive stains, but the image itself has stayed in better shape than these, although you can see up here in the corner where it's faded from purple to red. So this is what you're going to get on your Civil War CDVs. And this also happens if you have gelatin or collodion printing out processes that are also on cabinet cards. Any of the 19th century materials that have colloidal silver, which is pretty much all of them except for like the platinum print and a cyanotype, are all going to do this phenomenon. So why is that? I've been talking about this colloidal silver for a long time. So colloidal silver is a teeny tiny particle. If you think about the end of a pencil tip, that's sort of the size of one particle. On the right, this is a silver gelatin black and white photograph. It uses filamentary silver. So the difference between these two, these are magnified to the same level. This is a dark area of a 19th century photograph, and this is a dark area of a 20th century photograph. So you have all of this silver, these huge platelets of silver, which is why because there's so much of it, you get this really true rich black color. And here you just get all these particles sort of scattered together, but they never make a big clump. That's why you only get a reddish brown tone when you make a print. And that reddish brown tone wasn't really desirable, so almost everything gets gold tone if it's an albumin. Like I said, it was more an aesthetic choice for the salted paper prints to keep them brown. But the deterioration of silver works in this sort of mechanism. So you imagine this is one of those filaments of silver from a black and white gelatin print. So you have this huge amount of silver, and then you have these atmospheric pollutants that come in and start breaking off silver ions. And then what it breaks down to is either colloidal silver or silver sulfide. Now, 19th century photos start here. So you can imagine if you start deteriorating this tiny little dot, it doesn't take much for it to deteriorate, versus having a 20th century gelatin print is going to be way more stable because there's just so much more silver in the image. So this is just an example of how it fades. So this is a collodion POP that's so faded. So at the time it was gold toned and somebody put these nice little highlights of the hair in there, but it's faded so much that now that just looks weird. Versus gelatin print fading, so much silver, still retain all the blacks. Image looks pretty good, except you just get the edge mirroring. So it's all the silver oxides or sulfides sitting on the surface. And it usually comes from around the perimeter because that's where the airflow can come in. So it's a huge loss of 19th century silver that cannot be returned back. Where, you know, this kind of thing and silver mirroring removal is a little bit controversial, but if you were to do it, it would look really black underneath. There's no bringing this back. So, and then the last thing that's also a little bit of a problem of 19th century photographs is iron Gall ink. So iron Gall ink is an iron-based writing media that was popular at the time. And iron is a transition metal that can float from one state to the other. So Fe2, iron 2, is a stable form of iron, but Fe3 is an unstable form of iron. And if you have this kind of ink, and you have it can be a variety of things. A lot of it's atmospheric pollutants, but also moisture. It will start to break down. It'll move from one state to the other, so from Fe2 to Fe3. And when it does that, it becomes very corrosive. So I'm sure you've seen a lot of letters from the 19th century where there have been holes in them like this. But you also have that same media on a lot of cabinet cards to identify them. But I will tell you, this is the one thing photography has going for it. Photographs could not be made on bad quality paper. So all photographic papers are made from good quality cotton rag without metal impurities. So you just couldn't coat an emulsion with a metal impurity in it because it wouldn't make an image in that area. So they figured that out pretty early. So one thing we got going for us is the paper is really good. So you're not probably gonna see holes like this because writing paper was generally not, you know, they didn't purify it as much as they did photographic paper. So you probably won't get a lot of that, but I just want you to be aware because even if you have something like this and you're storing it with something like that, it could have an interaction. So what can you do? Well, I don't expect anybody to have this in their house. You know, obviously when I'm teaching, you know, I have to be practical because not everybody's working in a museum environment. But there are a lot of things that you can do to prevent a lot of this from happening because, as I like to give in the medical analogy, you are all the triage of the emergency room and I'm the surgeon. So you don't want to have to come to me, you want to just see the nurse and get out of there. So there's a lot that you can actually do. One of the things I talked about, all of this deterioration and the silver being so sensitive, in storage materials, we have something called the photographic activities test. And this is a test that's an independent testing. There's plenty of sites. The Library of Congress has their own site, but there are plenty all over the United States and Canada. People will submit their materials for testing to see if it reacts with silver. So generally you get, I mean, it can be anything. You know, archival boxes all the way down to the scrapbooking industry is really into this, so we can write with the gel pens and things like that and see if it will interact with silver. And what they do is they put it in this little metal jig with these detectors that have pure brands of silver. And so all of this is sort of compacted down into this little sandwich and put in an artificial aging chamber. And when it comes out, if any of those detector sheets are stained, that means it's interacted with silver, so it fails the PAT test. So this is really critical when you're selecting materials to put your photographs in. There are plenty of places to buy materials out there. These are the ones I recommend you go to, and you'll often see when you go to their pages, there'll be something that says past photographic activities test. Sometimes it's a triangle. If it doesn't say, please call them. They're very forthright about what has passed and what hasn't, so sometimes they just don't print it. If almost everything that's for photographic will say pass the PAT test in it, but if you're looking at something, I don't know, for like LP record storage or something that like might work for an object you have but isn't specifically designed for photographs, it may not say pass the PAT test, but you can always call and ask, and more than likely it will have passed. So paper enclosures, I think, are a really useful thing to use. One, they're pretty inexpensive, and they come in a variety of sizes. I know 19th century photography tends to be a little all over the place and not uniform like 20th century photography is in size, but you can get these in a variety of standard 20th century print sizes, which can work, for 19th century materials. I would say that if you have a folder, say this is 8 by 10, and you have a CDV, you probably don't want to put this tiny thing in this ginormous folder. I would get something that's like a 4 by 5, so make the ratio of object to folder a little closer as much as you can. Paper photographs are great. Paper enclosures are great because they block out the light. But if you're, bringing your materials to the Civil War show, you probably don't want to have to pull things in and out of paper a bunch, so in that case, plastics will probably be better for you, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Paper enclosures come in two types, buffered and non-buffered. There were, in the 90s, our standard was you could only use unbuffered materials for photographs, but now that's not the case. So you can use either, and I will tell you that non-buffered materials cost more money than buffered materials because almost every piece of paper that's made on a machine is buffered, including all of your office things that come out of your laser printer. So running a whole day's worth of slurry that's non-buffered means to shut down and clean everything. So this is why non-buffered things are going to be more expensive, but you don't really need it. You can use the buffered ones, it's just fine. And buffered just means it has a calcium carbonate reserve in it, so it has something that just elevates the pH. Not so much that it's going to leave a chalky mess on your photograph, but it's somewhere between 8 and 9, where neutral is 7. And non-buffered doesn't mean it's acidic, it just means it hovers around 6.5 to 7.5. So it just sits at the neutral mark. Some things to keep in mind when you're buying these, because now there's a whole new industry of archival materials. I don't even like to use the word archival because it doesn't mean anything anymore. You can go to Staples or Office Max or wherever and find something that says archival on it. That doesn't, I can't even define that, it doesn't mean anything. Acid-free or pH neutral, that means it was pH 7 at the time it was made, but that doesn't guarantee that it will be pH 7 10 years from now. This is why that photographic activities test is really important. So you can stamp that acid-free label on anything that came out of the mill at pH 7, but that doesn't mean it's good quality. So just keep that in mind. So the plastic enclosures also go through the PAT test, and there's 3 types of plastics: polyester, propylene, and polyethylene. The pure polyester ones are usually have trade names of Mylar or Melanex. Melanex is the UK name. And probably this is useful for a lot of you that go to these shows. And again, you can get these sleeves in various sizes. And this is good if you have something that you want people to see, but you don't necessarily want people to put their hands on. So by putting a plastic enclosure on it, then you know, if someone's picking up something at your show, they can see what it is, and these are, you know, inert polyesters, they're very clear, they're not going to obscure the image, so people don't have to, you know, it minimizes the handling. But you have to get one of these that have passed the PAT test. I've bought a lot of things that are in those like baseball card things that are all yellowed. I wouldn't put, you saw what happens to those CDBs, don't put them in there. And then I know you're not labeling a lot, but I thought I would just cover this while I'm here. If you are labeling photographs, I suggest that you use a soft graphite pencil. Like if you go to the art supply store, a 6B lead pencil is a good one to choose. And if you are a collector of 20th century materials from the 60s and on, you probably have resin-coated photographs in your collection that have a plastic backing. The graphite pencil will not write on that plastic, so you have to get a pure graphite pencil. This is a Greta color pencil. I think actually some of those archival suppliers are now selling that because I pushed it so much to them. But you can also get these at art supply stores like Dick Blick, or I think even some of the Michael's Crafts have these. I will tell you that because there's no wood in them, they're really soft, so if you drop on the floor, it's going to break in half. So they're really cheap, just buy a couple. And then for the plastic enclosures, you can use a Sharpie marker to write on the enclosure, but don't write on the actual photograph with a Sharpie marker. I'm not advocating for that. And then for gloves, I think gloves are great. If you know, I use them when I'm looking at materials, you know, in the reading rooms of the library. They're not always like perfect for me as a conservator because sometimes I need my tactile sensation, but I also know that I wash my hands like more than people are suggesting for the coronavirus. So, but gloves are great, and I do want to say like nitrile gloves that you can get pretty much anywhere. Home Depot, even, you know, the CVS, they're cheap, you wear them, you throw them away. You can invest in the fancy white cotton gloves if that's what you like, but then you have to wash them and they shrink, and they get dirty, so it's easier to throw away a pair of nitrile gloves than it is to keep washing the white gloves. But if that's what you like, and I tell people if they like the white gloves, great, because something about putting a white glove on makes people think, oh, I have to handle things a little carefully. Great, it's a psychological thing. What I don't suggest are these white gloves that have these sort of plastic nubby grippy things that they sell. I've seen those actually make a mark in the emulsion, so I don't recommend those. And then as far as boxes go, there's all different types of boxes that you can get at those archival suppliers. You know, they also come in the standard 20th century sizes, but they do make them specifically for CDBs and for cabinet cards. If you're gonna stack things like this, I suggest you get a drop front box, which opens up one end, so you're not trying to expand the box with your hands to pull things out. I would also put interleaving tissue in between whatever you stack in these boxes, and interleaving tissue also has to pass the photographic activities test. And anything you put in direct contact with a photograph has to pass this test. And then there are even things like these boxes these are the most expensive ones. They're aligned with this corrosion intercept film. This is a good material, but it's not always necessary, although they do sell these sort of Ziploc bags that are corrosion intercept film that you can buy and put your cased objects in when you're not using them. Again, rehousing is great, but the temperature and humidity is really what's critical. These are just the standard ideals that we give to museums and institutions. Just to give you an idea, 75 degrees is room temperature. But if you lower your temperature and your storage to 65, it'll double the lifetime of your photographs. Nobody wants to keep their house at 65 though, so I'm just giving you the standard so you know. And then as far as your home, where to keep them, definitely not in your attic, it's too hot. Not in your garage either, because that's not climate controlled. maybe yours is, I don't know. Not in your basement, because then you could have flooding. So I like to say either, ideally, if you have a second floor, put it on the second floor. If you have a closet that's nice and in the dark, that's good too. And then if you need a conservator, and hopefully you don't, but maybe you do. I'm not doing stuff anymore, now that I'm at the library, but I do have a number of suggestions for you. There aren't a lot of photograph conservators working privately, I'm afraid. But the American Institute for Conservation is our professional organization, and they have a Find a Conservator field where you type in your zip code, and I'll tell you if there's someone around you. I do have, this is a friend, Jessica Keister. This is Jessica Keister's Steel City Conservation Center in Philadelphia is where I used to work for the last 12 years. Paul Messier is in Boston. I also worked for him. And then this is my classmate Gallon Weaver. He's out in San Francisco, if any of you are on the West Coast. My Midwest guy is retiring and not taking any more people, so I'm not certain where to send you in the middle of the country, but on the coast I can help you out. So I just want to thank Ron and Doug for inviting me here tonight, and I'm happy to take any questions if you have them. Oh, wow.
We have time for about maybe 5 minutes of questions.
Okay.
So. Thanks. I'm Chris Nelson. I'm giving the Lincoln talk shortly. I've got a whole bunch of them in my baseball card album over there because it keeps the air off them. People can look at them front and back without getting their grubby fingers on it. That includes my grandchildren, etc. I intuit from what you're saying that that's okay with you to put.
Yeah, it's fine to put them in the plastic, but I mean, I don't know where you purchased those holders.
Well, Billy Bob's baseball card store.
That stuff is acrylic.
Yeah, I mean, for your photographs, I'd probably replace them with the ones that you get that pass the PAT test.
Okay. And this may be a really terrible thing. CDBs, as you know, if they're out in boxes or floating around or it shows all that, they eventually get dirty. I've found that artist gum erasers, carefully used, can get the dirt off without any harm to the, and we're talking 40 years going back on that. Am I just lucky I haven't destroyed them, or is that something that you're okay with?
So again, those erasers can react with the silver, so you might not see, I mean, probably what you're doing is not terrible, but again, yeah, I mean, as a photoconservator, it's really difficult because there are so many adhesive in my lab and so many, materials that I just can't use because they don't pass the photographic activities test. So, best case scenario, no, don't use that. Yeah.
Let's take a question.
How do you distinguish between a salt print and a thin albumin print that's got some surface wear on it?
So a microscope is the short answer. Those can be a little bit tricky because even albumin, thin albumin will show the paper fibers, but you can, for me, a lot of it's, almost nothing is pristine from the 19th century, so I'm looking for small cracks in the surface where that albumin has formed from the expansion and contraction of the paper. I'm looking at surface glass. I mean, I have like a surface glass meter reading thing that also helps. I mean, this is not helpful to you, but for me, what I would do is more analytical than doing it by eye.
I've seen a lot of things sold as salt prints that are basically thin albumins with some surface wear.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things sold as a lot of things out there.
Somebody's on a hustle. I have a tintype great bust image of a Civil War soldier. It's been laying on its back for 20 years. The emulsion is curling. Is there any way of getting the emulsion to settle down to at least keep it? Because it's kind of gone over the hill by now, but is there any way to keep it? Because if you held it vertically, everything's going to go Oscarspiel.
I mean, I can't really answer that without seeing it, but Doug knows. Treating ambrotypes and tintypes is like the most difficult thing a photoconservator could do because they're just really unforgiving, and all of those layers of material, the varnish, the collodion binder, and the japanning are all soluble in different materials. So if you put one down, you'll dissolve the emulsion. If you put another down, you'll dissolve the varnish. So trying to get a material in underneath there to what we call consolidate, which would flatten that back down, it needs an adhesive. Whether or not could be done, I don't know without seeing it.
There's a whole lot of really great information I need for my little museum job I've got, a little tiny museum. Is there some way of getting some of that key information that I can take home with me? Like, do you have copies, or can I just...
Ron to do that for us.
If you don't mind, I mean, we can share that.
Yeah.
You're talking about the links to the...
Yeah, the links. And,
yeah.
Type of stuff.
We'll get that. We'll talk after.
Yeah,
that's what I thought.
Yeah. We got you.
If I have really clean hands and I want to touch the edge of my CDV, do I have to wear gloves?
No, you don't. If you handle it properly, but you know, like you take it and you put it on the table, then someone else is going to pick it up and put their thumb right on it. So if you feel comfortable with how you're handling it, and I hope you're doing it right, by picking it up at the edge, then no, that's
treat
fine.
them all like LPs.
Yes, exactly.
Everyone here is old enough to know.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Very good presentation. Great information that's here. I got a two-part question. Daguerreotypes that you get that maybe have a broken seal or a bad seal or whatever, you recommend going ahead and resealing all daguerreotypes that you may have? And then would you take that into, would it help for the future preservation of even ambrotypes and then tintypes in the case, should they be sealed with glass and that type of stuff?
So daguerreotypes are more sensitive to that kind of change from and require the seal. The ambrotypes don't need it per se because they're varnished, but in the case I showed that ruby ambrotype with the silver that wasn't varnished, that one I would definitely seal. So to me it just depends on case by case. I have sealed some ambrotypes, but you don't have to go and seal every ambrotype you have because it's totally coated. That varnish is very, very protective.
One more question.
And what are you using as a sealing tape?
I'm currently using Filmofos P90 Plus. The latest crop of P90 is terrible and does not stick to anything. But I also never put it on directly on the object, so I'm really into making what I call a Mylar Z-tray, where I weld the Mylar and then fold it so the daguerreotype sits inside, and then the brass mat doesn't come in direct contact with the plate, and the tape doesn't come in direct contact with the plate. So I know people don't have access to ultrasonic welding machines like I know work, but that's what I do. I'm trying to minimize the metal-to-metal contact and the airspace that's in there.
Okay. Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you.